Mrs. Mensah lived next door to the Owusu family. She would often see Mr. and Mrs. Owusu leave for work in the morning, leaving their young son, Kwame, alone in the house. One morning, Mrs. Mensah noticed that Kwame was sitting by the window, looking lonely and bored. She decided to check on him and see if he needed any help. As she entered the house, Mrs. Mensah was surprised to see that Kwame had been left with a note and a list of chores to complete while his parents were away. The note explained that Kwame was expected to clean his room, do his homework, and prepare a simple meal for himself. Mrs. Mensah was impressed by the responsibility that Mr. and Mrs. Owusu had entrusted to their son. She decided to keep an eye on Kwame from afar, making sure he was safe and didn't need any assistance. Throughout the day, Mrs. Mensah would occasionally check on Kwame, watching as he diligently completed his chores and studied for his exams. She was proud of the young boy for taking his responsibilities so seriously. When Mr. and Mrs. Owusu returned home from work, they were pleased to see that Kwame had completed all his tasks and was sitting quietly, reading a book. They thanked Mrs. Mensah for keeping an eye on their son and promised to return the favor someday. From that day on, Mrs. Mensah and the Owusu family became even closer, often looking out for each other and lending a helping hand when needed. As the days went by, Mrs. Mensah and Kwame became fast friends. She would often invite him over for a snack or to watch a movie together. Kwame loved listening to Mrs. Mensah's stories about her childhood and her experiences as a young woman. One afternoon, while Kwame was visiting Mrs. Mensah, he mentioned that he was struggling with his math homework. Mrs. Mensah, who had been a math teacher before retiring, offered to help him. Together, they worked through the problems, and Kwame finally began to understand the concepts. As the weeks turned into months, Kwame's grades began to improve, and he became more confident in his abilities. He would often thank Mrs. Mensah for her help and guidance, and she would smile and tell him that he was doing all the hard work. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Owusu were grateful for Mrs. Mensah's influence on their son. They would often invite her over for dinner, and they would all spend the evening laughing and talking together. As the years passed, Kwame grew into a bright and capable young man. He went on to attend a top university, where he studied engineering. Through it all, Mrs. Mensah remained a constant presence in his life, offering guidance and support whenever he needed it. One day, when Kwame was home on break from university, he went to visit Mrs. Mensah. He found her sitting in her favorite armchair, surrounded by photos and mementos from over the years. "Mrs. Mensah," Kwame said, "I don't know where I would be without you. You've been like a second mother to me, always there to offer advice and support." Mrs. Mensah smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "Kwame, you've been like a grandson to me," she said. "I'm so proud of the man you've become." And with that, Kwame hugged Mrs. Mensah tightly, grateful for the love and support she had shown him over the years.